everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Tonight we're going to keep it going with the Halloween stories. After all, we are officially approaching the weekend before Halloween, so it seems only fitting we keep the pace. We've got haunted houses, the real ones and the fake ones, but we've also got some terrifying and harrowing close calls. We've got police chases, and a couple of stories that really put the emphasis on the trick in trick-or-treating. And not the fun, ha-ha kind of trick either. Basically, stories to make you feel just a little spookier this Halloween season. So, let's get started, shall we? As a kid, I was pretty obsessed with the idea of there being a great pumpkin. Christmas has Santa, Easter has the bunny. Why can't Halloween have something that leaves presents too? I was young enough to consider a Charlie Brown cartoon evidence, yet old enough to remember the way to the pumpkin patch. It wasn't far. Sometimes Mom and I walked instead of driving. I waited until the night before Halloween and snuck out after my parents went to sleep. The walk itself didn't frighten me at all. I was too excited to be afraid, and too dumb to understand that humans were the real threat. I got to the pumpkin patch without incident, picked my spot, and waited for the mountains of candy I knew would be coming my way. It was almost 1 a.m. by then, and the longer I sat there, the more tired I became. I would drift off for a few moments, and then a random sound would jerk me back awake. Each time, a rush of adrenaline surged through me while I searched for the great pumpkin, and each time, the disappointment of his absence was crushing. This cycle happened for the last time just after 3:30, when I woke to the sound of nearby voices. They may have been in their late teens or early 20s, but I can't trust my perception of their age. The only thing I knew for certain was that they weren't ruining my last chance to see the great pumpkin. I still wasn't frightened. I was furious. How dare they? When I stood from my hiding place and ordered them to leave quietly, I genuinely believed that they would apologize, maybe even give me some candy and go. I heard their whole speech in my head, how they'd promised it would never happen again and wish me luck as they left. But yeah, obviously none of that happened. I was so far off base that I'm lucky just to be alive. They definitely hadn't known I was there. It startled them when an angry child suddenly emerged from the darkness. I launched into my speech without waiting for their response, and they stood silently gawking until I was finished. They were drinking from a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag, though I didn't understand anything about the effects of alcohol at that age either. We stared at each other in silence for a moment, and I only grew angrier. When they didn't respond with remorse, I thought they found my anger to be cute, like so many other adults. Well, they definitely didn't think I was cute. Eventually, they burst into laughter, and I completely lost my temper. I began screaming that they ruined Halloween by scaring away the great pumpkin, and the longer I yelled, the louder they laughed. They carried on for so long that I completely lost hope and turned to leave. That's when the heavier of the two men finally regained his composure and hurried to block my path. He apologized with all the words I imagined they would say, only now it was too late. The great pumpkin was gone, and it was all their fault. I tried backing away and bumped into the smaller man. He had moved much closer, and I was now sandwiched between the two. The heavier one apologized again and offered me a drink from their bottle. I still didn't see this as a threat. I thought they were genuinely trying to make amends, but a sip of their drink wasn't going to cut it. Next, they offered to take me for ice cream, and when that didn't work, there was suddenly a puppy in their car. They tried every trick in the book, and the only reason none of them worked was because I wanted to see the great pumpkin that badly. Once I was too sleepy to care about their groveling, I announced that I was going home and never wanted to see them again. Then the men said that the least they could do was drive me home and asked which way I lived. Wouldn't you know it, my house was the same direction they were headed. Well, that one got me thinking. It was a longer walk and it only seemed that much further after staying up all night. I had also grown paranoid that my parents would wake up while I was gone. I may have been extremely ignorant, but I understood exactly how much trouble I would be in if they realized what I'd done. So yes, a ride home actually sounded like a great idea. Those guys walked me to an old car that smelled like a skunk, and I climbed in the back seat with 0 alarm bells sounding in my head. At first, they really did drive in the right direction, and there was what I thought to be polite conversation. They asked if I wasn't afraid to be walking around at night all alone, and I, a cocky little shit, told them all about how I was too smart to believe in ghosts or monsters. I knew those things were only in fairy tales, yet things like the Great Pumpkin and Santa Claus, no, those were real. I'll never forget the look on the smaller man's face when he turned back and asked how I felt about people. He was enjoying my ignorance very much. I think he wanted me to understand I was in danger, like he wanted to see the aha moment on my face when everything clicked. Well, if that's true, then he got his wish, but it took me longer than I care to admit. He played coy, slow-walking me through what-if scenarios while the bigger man followed my directions home. Then, as we approached the last stop sign before my house, I said to take a left, and my house was the third one on the right. That's when the smaller man asked what I would do if they just kept driving. What did I think I even could do? Still thinking it was all one big joke, I said something along the lines of beating them up, something clearly beyond my ability, and was rewarded with another round of hysterical laughter. Meanwhile, we had come to a full stop. No cars were in sight. But we weren't turning. We were just sitting there. And then we kept going straight. I was done playing with these guys. I just wanted to crawl into my bed and sleep, but they wanted to play these ridiculous games all night. In a burst of sheer anger, I lunged forward, grabbing the wheel, and took us over the curb. The smaller man slapped me, hard, and I flew back into my seat. That's when reality finally came crashing down on me. Everything clicked into place, and I understood that these men did not want to be my friends. The smaller man said that if I laid on the floorboard and stayed silent, he wouldn't crawl back there and make the first slap look like a love tap. I was so frightened that I complied. I didn't know what I was going to do or what was going to happen, but I knew I couldn't handle being struck again. My entire head was throbbing, and the side of my face felt like it was on fire. It terrifies me to admit this, but had no one intervened, I probably would have followed their orders all the way up to digging my own grave. From the floorboard, I watched as we left behind the dim lighting in my quiet neighborhood for a bright glow of the still busy highway. It was no longer the middle of the night, but early morning, and people were trying to get to work. I was never planning an escape. I was just hoping with every fiber of my being that someone would save me. And I got lucky. The two men had been talking, but I'm not sure about what. I just happened to notice that they suddenly clammed up, like something had frightened them. Then the smaller man turned to look out the back of the car, then down at me. His tone shifted to one of kindness, and he seemed like an entirely different person as he thanked me for being so well behaved. In fact, they only kidnapped bad little boys, and considering how they found me, they were sure that I was one. Now, they had seen the error of their ways, and they were just looking for a place to turn around so they could take me home. Well, I'm excited to report I had finally learned my lesson. I didn't believe a word he said. Before he could stop me, I climbed back into my seat and saw what had scared him so badly. There was a cop behind us. I began screaming and pounding on the back window, the officer saw me and turned on his lights, and my kidnapper punched the gas. The pursuit lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. All the while, the smaller man was screaming what he planned to do with me when they lost the cop. I never cried so hard in my life. I thought that they were going to escape and that I had just made my situation that much worse. But they turned into a neighborhood and became trapped on a dead-end street. They had no choice but to leave me and the car behind while they were trying to escape on foot. A minute later, officers were pulling me from the car, and shortly after, my kidnappers were in handcuffs. I didn't know my address, but I was able to describe the pumpkin patch well enough for one of the cops to recognize it. Once they got me back there, I was able to guide them to my house. My parents lost their minds when they opened the door to see me with all of the police, and I had stranger danger lessons every day for the next 3 years. But I had already received the only lesson I needed. To this day, I treat every stranger like a potential kidnapper. Is that healthy? Probably not. But I haven't been kidnapped a single time since, and that's all I'm really looking for. Happy Halloween, everyone, and please, if you have a kid that believes in the Great Pumpkin, keep an extra eye on them, okay? Hey, so my friend Dallas just told me this weird story about a party that she went to last night. She made me promise not to tell, so shh, but I'm gonna tell you. Just change her name to a city or something. Okay, so this morning, my phone had a bunch of missed calls and texts from Dallas asking if I was at Donnie's or if I was at home and if she could come over. The house party she was at was apparently a couple blocks down from my apartment, like on Clinton by the 7-Eleven. I'm reading through these messages and they're getting progressively more unsettling as I go. Then her last message said that she's running to my apartment. Please be home. These were all sent around 3 a.m. last night, the last one being 3:42. But I got these messages after 9 a.m. when my phone turned back on while driving home from Donnie's. I'm like, oh shit, did this bitch get her ass murdered last night? Like, what's going on, you know? So I'm calling her over and over on the freeway, but it goes straight to voicemail every time. Then I get to my apartment, and I find her fast asleep on my welcome mat, still in her cupcake costume. I'm shocked that none of my neighbors have called the cops or checked to see if she was alive by the time I got there. She had sticks and leaves and shit all up in her hair, and she was all sprawled out like a dead body up against my door. Like, I thought that's what I was walking up on. I kicked the bottom of her heel and was like, Dallas? Boom. She fucking wakes up and scrambles to her feet with this crazy look on her face. I'm like, holy shit, girl, what happened? Dallas starts bawling and hugs me. We're out in the hallway for a little bit, just hugging as she sobbed. After she let go, I let us into the apartment. Dallas walks to the love seat and crashes down on it. I again say, girl, what happened last night? She says some really creepy kids showed up at the party last night with all black eyes. I asked if it was a costume, and she was like, no, they weren't wearing costumes. They looked to be about 12 or 13. She'd seen someone let them in and was standing next to the owner of the house. So they both saw these kids, way too young to be at this party, come inside. Then they all separate and walk in different directions through the small crowd of people. The owner's like, what the fuck, and walks over to the guy who let them in. He tells him one of the kids said that their mom was inside, asking if they could go look for her. Homeowner doesn't believe the story, and Dallas watches him beeline it to the closest one that he can catch. When he gets to the kid, he spins her around by the shoulder. But as he's interrogating her, his nose starts to leak like a faucet, so much that the guy had to plug it with his t-shirt and run to the bathroom. The girl he'd stopped then turns and looks directly at Dallas. Then she says the light bulb above her head popped, sending glass down onto her and the people around her. Yeah, multiple light bulbs all exploded over her head at the same time. Nobody around her was paying attention to what was going on, and they were all equally shocked when they got showered in glass. Dallas said these kids were evil, like biblical evil. She's saying that it felt like the little girl was trying to pull her soul out. So that's when Dallas went into the backyard and started texting me. Apparently the girl followed her out there, and when Dallas saw her, she freaked out and ran back inside the house. She said when she went back inside, the vibe of the house had completely changed. The music was off and people were just wandering around, not talking to each other. That's when something in her stomach told her to run, so she did. When her phone died, she just waited outside my door until I got home. No, yeah, this all just happened. She literally just left my place. Fucking weird, right? It was 1977. I'd taken time off of work to have a baby and stay home with her, but I still needed an income. So my mother had hired my younger sister and me to do the dirty, back-breaking work in her shop while she took care of her first infant granddaughter. Around Halloween, my sister and I were working at our mom's antique store. Mom had just gotten a truckload of European oak furniture that needed to be cleaned and polished, have the handles screwed on, so on and so forth. A nice-looking man came into the store and started talking to my sister, who was 17 at the time. He introduced himself as Ted Smith, and we laughed and said that we must be related as Mom's maiden name was Smith also. He chatted both of us up, but focused on my sister for the most part. He purchased an armoire, but said that he'd have to go get his truck, since at the moment he was driving a Volkswagen Bug, an old Volkswagen Bug. He then asked my sister and me if we wanted to go out to dinner that night with him. We were sweaty and dirty from work. I had a baby to care for, and Sis already had a boyfriend, so we said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Ted." He asked me to ride with him to get his truck so he could drop off his Bug at the auto shop for repairs. But by that point, I had to get home to my infant, right away, because I was still nursing her, and I thought my breasts were going to begin leaking at any minute. However, he wouldn't give up trying to get one or both of us away from the shop. He said he could come back about 10 that evening for his armoire and asked whether one or both of us would still be there. We replied, "No, we close the shop up at 6 and we both have places to be tonight." He was persistent. "How about tomorrow night?" "No, we close at 6, except on Sundays when we close at 4. He asked whether one of us could meet him early in the morning, like at 5:30 a.m., but neither of us wanted to. He was getting to be a bit creepy, and Sis and I were eye-rolling at each other. Eventually, he said that he was sorry, but he couldn't buy the armoire if we couldn't be flexible. We hated to give up the sale, but after he had been there for 2 hours, we thought that he was just looking and taking up our time. We still had a lot of work to do on the furniture that had just arrived in the shop. Finally, we just wanted to finish our work and go home. At 6 p.m. as we were leaving, his Volkswagen Bug was parked outside, and he asked us whether we wanted to go get coffee. He especially wanted my sister to go. We said, "Thanks, Ted, but no thanks. Like we said earlier, we have plans." But he continued to be insistent. Finally, I said, "Sis, let's go. I'll take you home." Even though she had her car there, for some reason, I didn't want her to drive home alone around this guy. So he drove off in his Bug, and we really didn't think of it again. Until the next year, when this picture appeared in the paper. Ted Bundy. It still sends chills up my spine writing this, and Sis and I talk about it occasionally. We were 2 lucky young women that day. If either of us had agreed to go, we would have likely been raped and murdered, like so many other women that Bundy kidnapped. Last Halloween was my senior year of high school, and my friends wanted to do something special. We went to a haunted house, a corn maze, and a hayride before finishing the night off with an escape room, but that last part is where things went wrong. We didn't actually know about the escape room until we were leaving the hayride. On the walk back to the parking lot, we ended up talking to one of the other customers, and he asked if we'd heard about it. He said other people had been talking about it all night and seemed fairly impressed. It was set up in a warehouse just outside of town, but it was so dark that when we got there, we almost kept driving. But then a man with a glow stick waved us in. He said that they just started closing but didn't mind staying open for one more group. It was just after 11:30, so that seemed like a pretty reasonable story. We were led into the warehouse, where a woman with a cash box took our $15 cover charges, and then we were led through a small waiting area. As we entered the actual escape room, he said the door that we came through would be barred. To get out, we had to find the key that would open the door on the opposite side. Once the four of us were shut in, the lights dimmed considerably, and we quickly realized all of the decorations were extremely cheap. Like worse than what you would see at a first grader's Halloween party. The door we were meant to exit had been held shut with a padlock, so the search for the key began. The large space was filled with shelves, tackle boxes, tool chests, and filing cabinets. Many of them also required keys to open, and we moved those to one location. After several minutes of intense searching, we had a handful of keys and nothing else. There were no riddles, no codes, no pictures, just hundreds of keys and half as many locks. To say we were disappointed is an understatement. We all took a handful of keys and started trying them everywhere. Once certain they were duds, we threw them into a discard pile and moved on to the next. Occasionally, we would get something open only to find another keyring inside. After 30 minutes of this, we were pretty much over it. We banged on both of the doors saying we forfeited, but no one came to let us out. Next, we tried to find a number for the place online, but all of our phones said no service. We couldn't even get a text to send. The girls became frightened, which made Jared and I feel the need to act tough. We threatened to break down the door if someone didn't let us out, and then we actually tried, but all we did was hurt our shoulders. My girlfriend suggested it was a trap, and I tried to convince her that it was all part of the experience, an extra thrill designed to compensate for the lack of atmosphere, but I didn't believe it. We really had no choice but to keep playing or waiting until someone found us, and we didn't know how long that would take. For the next 3 hours, we painstakingly tried every key and every lock, until we found one that opened a filing cabinet, which contained a small, locked chest. After another hour, we found one that opened the chest. Inside was a wooden puzzle box. I'd seen a few on YouTube and knew how they worked, but we were long out of patience by that point. A quick shake told us there was definitely something inside that sounded like a key, and that's all I needed to know. I threw the cheap box onto the ground and stomped it into splinters. A single red object lay among the remnants, our key to freedom. My hands shook as I placed it into the door's padlock and felt the satisfying click of its release. We yanked it open to almost total darkness outside. The only light source came from the stars shining through the warehouse's high windows. We had to use our flashlights to find our way back to the front and outside. The girls didn't want to come at first. They thought that people were waiting to attack in the darkness, but I didn't understand why they would have waited so long if that was the goal. I had a different paranoia in mind, and I was anxious to prove myself wrong. Unfortunately, my theory turned out to be correct. 3 of us had phones to provide extra light, so we made it to the parking lot without wasting too much extra time. But our car, along with the girls' purses, my laptop, Jared's wallet, and a fair amount of other stuff, was gone. That's about the time all of our phones began blowing up with missed calls and texts, all except for Liv, who had left her phone charging in the car. We called the police and then our families. Everyone showed up within a few minutes of each other, and we explained the whole story. Apparently, the same thing had happened to other groups of kids in other states over the previous years. They had all been out just like we were, and around midnight or later, someone randomly told them about a new escape room. It looked closed when each party arrived, and then a man suddenly offered to stay open a little longer if they wanted to stay. The guy's description matched the same person we saw. So please, if you're out making the rounds this year and someone recommends a new escape room you didn't know about, just skip it. I'm a 37-year-old female from South Dakota, and I've lived in the same house with my family for 7 years now. My partner and I are both accountants. We make a decent living, but we also have 3 kids, so extra money isn't really a thing. Plus our oldest, she's 13, has a heart condition that has required several surgeries during the course of her life. Before moving into our current home, we lived in a small 2-bed, 1-bath duplex, and our neighbors were all the worst cliches. They were constantly fighting, playing loud music, having parties, or, my favorite, locking their dog in the bathroom and letting it bark all night. We already wanted to move, we just couldn't afford the privilege. But then my youngest was born, and our previously cramped space was now absolutely impossible to navigate. We had no choice but to find somewhere else, even if that meant moving further away from the city. And to cut an irrelevant part of the story short, our realtor eventually asked if we believed in ghosts. Honestly, no, not even a little. My partner and I were both huge skeptics. Notice I said were. I went so far as to say something along the lines of, why? Do you have the perfect 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom just sitting around the corner, but no one will buy it because of the terrible things that happened inside? I really was only joking, but then his expression morphed into one of nausea and surprise. It was actually a 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath, and it was still 40 miles outside of the city. But it was well within our price range, and that was the kind of luxury worth sacrificing a little drive time for. The house had sat empty for so long that our realtor asked us to wait a few days while he got the utilities turned on. There were a few cosmetic issues, but everything else was in great condition. It passed inspection with flying colors. Everything else, down to the golden plumbing fixtures, was absolutely hideous, but we remodeled bit by bit over the years. Anyway, you're probably wondering what atrocities happened in the house to make it so cheap in the first place. In the 60s, a couple lived here with their grown son, Anthony. Anthony suffered from some kind of mental illness, but no one could be sure which one. Many have said that he was never officially diagnosed, just clearly disturbed, and most agreed that he often experienced paranoid delusions. One Halloween, some other family members stopped by as they were passing through town. They were on a vacation but wanted to take the kids trick-or-treating. It was another couple with 2 young boys, and they ended up staying the night. At some point, Anthony woke up to the sound of movement downstairs and thought it was an intruder. He retrieved one of his father's hunting rifles from the gun cabinet and went down to protect the family. The 2 children had gotten out of bed. Maybe they wanted a glass of water, maybe they were looking for a restroom, or maybe they were just kids getting into mischief. Probably the latter. Regardless of the reason, they both perished on the kitchen floor. Anthony and the children's parents rushed downstairs at roughly the same time, and the weapon was fired once more. But thankfully, no one else was injured. Anthony was sent to an asylum where he ended his own life a few years later, but several of the previous owners have claimed to see an apparition fitting his description. A handful of people have lived in the house since, but they all moved out within 2 or 3 years until it finally just didn't sell again. It was March when we moved in, and our whole family instantly fell in love. We bonded over decorating our new spaces, and laughed at the fools who missed out on the deal of a lifetime because of silly superstitions. For 7 months, nothing remotely out of the ordinary happened, but the second October rolled around. It was like we were thrown into an entirely different universe. Doors suddenly started slamming shut by themselves. Footsteps sounded above our heads when no one was up there. And sometimes, but not as often, we'll hear a little boy crying. When my youngest was smaller, I used to confuse it for him. But now when it happens, I know it's just the ghost. Nothing strange has ever happened outside of October. All year long, our home is like a paradise. But from October 1st through October 31st, it's a pure hell house. Halloween is always the worst, too. I don't know if it's because it's also the anniversary of the children's deaths, or if it's just because it's Halloween. I don't really care to find out anymore either. My partner and I used to let the kids stay with friends that one night while we toughed it out. But that came to an end 3 years ago, when I almost broke my leg in the shower. My eyes were closed as I stood beneath the faucet, rinsing off the last of the soap. When I opened them, I saw the shadow of a very large man on the outside of the curtain. I yanked it back so hard that I fell over, nearly snapping my leg the way I landed. The curtain fell with me to reveal an empty bathroom. No one was there. Not really. After collecting myself for a few moments, I finally regained enough control to stand, but as I rushed to leave, I noticed a large handprint on the mirror, twice the size of my own, and it looked as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass and dragged it all the way down. I instinctively began wiping it away with my towel, and as my hand raced back and forth, I caught a glimpse of a large, hairy man standing right behind me. His expression was wild and menacing, but just like that, he was gone again. Ever since that incident, we've spent our Halloweens in a hotel. There's also a dozen examples of small things going missing only to turn up in strange places, but I figure that's the kind of stuff you guys hear all the time. The volume on the TVs and the music randomly going up and down, and there's been occasions that they shut off entirely. My partner and I haven't had many nightmares, but my youngest had dreamed of playing with 2 other little boys in our house. Thankfully, the shower thing was by far the worst any of us have experienced, and I'm just grateful it happened with me instead of the kids. But I would love to know, has anyone else experienced these kinds of anniversary hauntings? Everything is just so normal the rest of the time that it's hard to believe it's the same house. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. But thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here, so thanks again. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open just long enough to find those deep sleep videos and, of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour, YT. Stay spooky.